Did Muhammad exist? We have both of our debaters, Robert Spencer and David Wood, with their 12-minute opening statements. Now we're going to go back to David with a rebuttal. David, it's all you. You've got 8 minutes, and we'll tell you when you have 30 seconds left.
Thank you, Chris. All right, well, there are a few things Robert and I agree on. We agree that there should be evidence where there is no evidence. If Muhammad were really going out and conquering, and then his followers were to carry this on in the name of Islam, energized by the Quran, as Robert says, then we should expect to find all these references in all these places for all these people who are being conquered. We should expect to find all kinds of references to the Quran and Muhammad, and we don't, not for a long time. So we have to ask ourselves why. We have to ask ourselves why this is, and we both agree that that is a huge problem for the Muslim story, and we agree that there's a way of examining material like this and coming up with historical kernels of truth, and that's the principle of embarrassment. Where we disagree on here is Robert thinks there are explanations for these things, and that's the response to the principle of embarrassment. If I say no one would invent this kind of story, and you could come up with reasons why people would invent that kind of story, then you've just responded to the argument. So the question is, do Robert's reasons for why people would invent these kinds of stories about Muhammad, do they look like good explanations or the best explanations for the evidence that we have? And I would say no. If you look at the approach Robert is taking, he has a kind of means to end approach. There's something that the people who are inventing stories about Muhammad want to accomplish. There's some doctrine they want to get across, and so they invent this story in order to justify this doctrine or defend this kind of doctrine. And my response would be, I can easily come up with a different way of achieving the same end that doesn't involve embarrassing Muhammad. In other words, if the only point is to defend some doctrine, I can think of better ways to defend that doctrine without making Muhammad look bad. So let's go through these. Muhammad's first impression of his revelations is that he was demon-possessed, and he became suicidal afterwards. Robert's claim is that these stories might have been invented because people wanted to show that Muhammad wasn't a victim of demonic possession, and he didn't kill himself because he was protected or something like that, because he was exonerated in the end of these stories. Now think, if all you want to show is that Muhammad isn't getting these by demonic inspiration, why don't you just say that? Why don't you have people saying it to Muhammad? Muhammad, you're the victim of demonic possession. You're possessed. You're so horrible, something like that. And then Muhammad saying, no, I'm not, and here's my proof. Here are some miracles. Because you can invent whatever you want, right? We're inventing prophets out of thin air here, or at least with very little historical information to go on. You can invent all kinds of ways to justify and show that someone is not possessed by demons. You can have a miraculous sign, a voice of God, something like that justifies him. You don't need to make him look like he can't tell the difference between a revelation from God and a revelation from Satan, or make him look unsure of the origin of his revelations. We have the satanic verses, and this for me, this is the most important one, because I have 37 sources that describe variations of the satanic verses story, and there's a clear pattern of development. Namely, in the earliest versions of the story, Muhammad delivers these verses to his followers. He's tricked by Satan. Satan tricks him into delivering these revelations, and then Muhammad comes back later and says, the devil tricked me. Later versions of the story say Muhammad didn't deliver the verses. Satan just imitated Muhammad and sounded like him. So he imitated Muhammad's voice, and so people thought it was Muhammad, but then it wasn't really Muhammad. Still later, people cut out all of that out, and just have the pagans bowing down in honor of this revelation. Well, why were they bowing down? According to the original story, they were bowing down because Muhammad honored their gods. But later, they just had the story about the pagans bowing down, and it's the context is totally taken out. And so you lose the historical core by the time you get to the great collections of ahadith. So what you have is, obviously the story was very embarrassing even at its earliest stages, because Muslims immediately start trying to water the story down and eventually try to get rid of it altogether. In fact, by the time Ibn Hisham comes up with his recension of Ibn Ishaq, he takes the story out because it was too embarrassing to Muslims. Now, the question is, why would someone invent this kind of story if it was obviously so embarrassing? And Robert's explanation was, hey, these things are in a state of flux. Different people are coming up with different things. But I have this kind of idea of what I would call historical momentum. In order for a story to kind of push through several generations, when it's obviously embarrassing to the people, it needs to have a certain amount of momentum. And a person or a group of people coming up with this story one day that's obviously embarrassing to the Muslim, to the community at large, it's not going to have the kind of momentum that's going to push it through several generations and have Muslims trying to explain it away. They're just going to reject it. The only way that it could have that momentum to go through several generations is if the first generation knew that it happened, and that's why they passed it on. And the second generation knew that it happened because their parents told them. And then it's not until you start getting farther and farther away that people can start watering the story down. And so I would say for all of these stories, the only way these stories would keep going is if we had a certain amount of historical momentum that I just don't see happening if someone's sitting around free to invent these stories. Now, the story of Muhammad as a victim of black magic, well, Muhammad was victorious in the end. Well, again, you could do that in other ways. You don't need to have, I mean, think about it. Jesus wasn't the victim of black magic, right? We don't believe that would happen to Jesus. But it doesn't occur to us to say, well, yeah, he was a victim of a spell and he was walking around all weird and out of his mind and delusional for a year and a half, but then he was victorious in the end. Why? We don't need that. We don't need that. If we want to know why we believe in Jesus, it would have to do with things like his miracles or his resurrection. We don't need him to succumb to black magic in order to break free of it to show that we should believe in him. As far as Muhammad's extra wives, Robert says, well, this was to show that he was superior in sexual virility or something like that. Again, you don't need that. Muhammad could have had 4 wives. He could have stayed faithful to his 4 wives, to that revelation. And he could have just had a lot of sex with them. And then, of course, he's allowed to have a slave girl. So he could have 4 wives and like 100 slave girls. And that would have allowed him to stay consistent with his revelation. Instead, we find him getting special revelations that give him more partners. That if the only goal is to be really sexually mighty, he didn't need to do that at all. As far as Muhammad's death, Robert says that the story was meant to demonize Jews. Well, you could have had him die in battle. You could have had him die in battle fighting the Jews. I mean, really, being defeated after being poisoned by a Jewish woman whose family he had slaughtered, that makes me think that Muhammad's not too bright. I mean, he's eating food brought to him by a woman whose family he just slaughtered. I wouldn't eat something that was brought to someone whose family was just slaughtered, but Muhammad does. This doesn't inspire any confidence in Muhammad. So if the goal...
30 seconds.
And finally, Zainab, Robert says that the point of this story is to deny that Muhammad had any children. Again, any sons. There's a way to do that. Again, you don't have to have this entire affair of Muhammad marrying the divorced wife of his own adopted son and so on. You could just say Muhammad didn't have any sons or that his sons died, something like that. Point is, we can have all of these ends that Robert says we need. We can do that without these horrible stories that are obviously embarrassing to the early Muslim community.
Thank you, David, for your 8-minute rebuttal. Now we're going to reset the clock for Robert, and we're going to go ahead and give Robert 8 minutes to...
Actually, none of these stories were embarrassing to the early Muslims, according to the early Muslim records, except the Zainab story. That's the only one. It has to be emphasized that all the others that David has adduced here, the demon possession, the suicidal tendencies, even the satanic verses, the black magic, the special exception for the extra wives, and the poisoning by the Jews, there is no hint in the Islamic traditions. Well, leave aside the satanic verses, that's a special case also. But there's no hint for any of the others that they were embarrassing to the early Muslims. It's just like with the story of Muhammad and Aisha and his consummating the marriage with Aisha when she was 9 and he was 54. There's no indication that anybody looked askance at that or that the early Muslims thought there was anything scandalous about that. That's a tale that embarrasses 21st century Muslims. As the rest of these that David has pointed out, they embarrass 21st century Muslims, but they didn't embarrass Muslims in the 9th century or the 8th. Now, as far as the other things go, certainly, yes, there are other better ways to defend doctrines than inventing stories that embarrass Muhammad, but here again, I'm afraid that David is practicing kind of anachronism. It's easy for 21st century people to see that there were easier ways to do this or better ways to do this, but we cannot be sure that that was known or seen as clearly by Muslims in the 9th century or the 8th century when these stories were being invented. They were invented in a particular historical context, and it may be that they were invented in the context of controversies that were going on that they were designed to reply to. And that being the case, it may be that they were invented in order to serve particular ends that we cannot know today. But here again, the long historical gap between the time that Muhammad is supposed to have lived and the time that these stories show up militates against their being historically accurate. After all, we're talking about, David's point is well taken about there's nothing in the story in the Gospels about Jesus being the victim of black magic. It's made very clear in other ways that he has power over that kind of thing. He doesn't have to walk around under its influence for a year and a half and so on. But here again, when we're talking about Islam, we're talking about a very different cultural context where the existence of jinns is taken for granted. The existence of mischievous spirits who are always interfering with the daily lives of ordinary human beings is taken for granted. And so it's just, I think, a mistake to assume that it would have been so clear to the early Muslims that there were easier ways to establish the points that they wanted to establish. Now, as far as the satanic verses go, clearly, yes, the embarrassment of that story set in rather quickly. And that's why, as David points out, there are these various stages where first Muhammad is inspired by Satan, and then it's Satan imitating Muhammad, and then it's the pagans bowing down about these stories without any context regarding Muhammad or the Quran or Islam. But here again, it's not necessarily established from that the first generation knew that it happened, that Muhammad had done that, and that therefore they had to explain it away somehow. It's also perfectly reasonable to consider that the story was first invented by the Arab leaders in order to paper over various contradictions and changes that they were making in Islamic doctrine as it was developing. But then, once it was out there, they had to explain it away because they realized that they had entangled themselves in a new contradiction by having their wonderful, infallible prophet, who is the perfect model of human behavior, have this inspiration from Satan. And so it was a story, it's like when you tell a lie and then you have to tell another lie to cover it up. They had invented this story in order to explain contradictions in their own material, but then they had to explain away their explanation. And so it might not be that the first generation knew that Muhammad had done it, but that the first generation knew that it had been widely published, and so that had to be explained away. But it doesn't necessarily have any connection to any real Muhammad at all. What we're talking about, after all, is stories that arise in the 9th century, 125, 150, 200 years after Muhammad is supposed to have lived. And so we're talking about stories of which there is no indication whatsoever before that. And let me just give you an example of the reliability of the sources upon which we're relying to talk about all this. Let me give you an account of the raid of Harar from Ibn Ishaq, Muhammad's first biographer, from the middle of the 8th century. And he says this is all he says about the Battle of Harar. Meanwhile, the messenger of God had sent Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas on campaign with 8 men from among the Muhajirun. He went as far as Harar in the Hijaz, then he returned without having had a clash with the enemy. 50 years later, al-Waqidi has all this. Then the messenger of God appointed Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas to the command against Harar, Harar being part of Jufa near Qum, in Dhul Qadda, 18 months after the hijrah of the messenger. Abu Bakr ibn Ismail ibn Muhammad said on the authority of his father, on the authority of Amir ibn Sa'ad, on the authority of his father, the messenger of God said, O Sa'ad, go to Harar, for a caravan belonging to Quraysh will pass through it. So I went out with 20 or 21 men on foot. We would hide during the day and travel at night until we arrived there on the morning of the 5th day. We found that the caravan had passed through the day before. The messenger had enjoined upon us not to go beyond Harar. Had we not done so, I would have tried to catch up with it. How is it that al-Waqidi knows so much more detail about this story 50 years after Ibn Ishaq? Obviously, it was made up. But it was made up in a cultural context that is so immensely different from the one in which we are operating now that it would be presumptuous for us to assume that we can know all the reasons why these stories were invented. Here again, the criterion of embarrassment is an important one. But what embarrasses us does not embarrass necessarily the Muslims of the time in which these stories were being developed. And the historical gap between the time when Muhammad is supposed to have lived and the time that these stories arose makes it impossible for these to have been historically accurate.